Mark. Then they came to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. The people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. In their synagogue was a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus rebuked him and said, "Quiet, come out of him." The unclean spirit convulsed him, and with a loud cry came out of him. All were amazed and asked one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." His fame spread everywhere throughout the whole region of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
When I was in college, I was required to read a certain novel in one of my classes, and it's one of my favorite novels, mostly because I haven't really read a whole lot of novels. I'm embarrassed to say that when I was going through school, I wasn't always the diligent student with classwork. Right? But when I was in college, I had to read this book called The Brothers Karamazov. It's written by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And if you're familiar with Fyodor Dostoevsky, right, many of his writings, a lot of times the theme is evil. It's basically stories about how evil impacts the world and causes immense destruction. The theme of Dostoevsky's books is often that sometimes it seems like in life that there is more darkness than there is light. There is more suffering than there is joy. It's one of the themes of many of his novels. And in this story of the Brothers Karamazov, it's about, you guessed it, some brothers, the main characters of the story, of the Karamazov family. And basically what you see throughout the story is how the sinfulness of the brothers and their father basically causes an immense amount of destruction and dysfunction in their personal lives. And you see the effect of the sinfulness. And I'm reminded of this book today because I'm reminded of a particular scene in the story of the Brothers Karamazov. And it has to do with a young woman named Grushenka. Nice Russian name, right? Grushenka. How would you like to have that name? Anyway, Grushenka was this girl's name, and she was a sort of, what you would say, kind of a person of ill repute, you might say. And Grushenka was this young woman who realized that she had a certain power over men at times to seduce them and basically make them do whatever she wanted. And it turns out over the course of the story that she actually does this to the Karamazov family and basically makes multiple members of the family basically fall in love with her, and it causes immense amount of havoc, right, in the family. But one of the brothers' names is Alyosha. And Alyosha is he kind of ends up being the hero of the story, even though throughout much of the story, people think that he's naive. They call him basically like a romantic, somebody who's not really realistic about the way things are, and has high ideals, right, and hopes for the world and for humanity. And Alyosha actually ends up becoming a monk, which makes him look even more naive to especially his brother Ivan, who's basically like an intellectual, educated, thinking that we've moved beyond the need for God and religion. So Alyosha is kind of portrayed as this throughout the story. But there's this really remarkable scene in the story of the Brothers Karamazov where Alyosha is experiencing a a very difficult time personally. And he happens to run into Grushenka, this woman of ill repute. And Grushenka secretly has an evil desire to basically bring about Alyosha's destruction of his vocation as a monk and to seduce him as well. And there's this beautiful interchange that takes place when they find themselves alone together in his home, where as she begins to seduce him, she recognizes that Alyosha sees her in a different way than any of the other men she's encountered sees her. He does think she's beautiful. He does think she's attractive. But he sees that Grushenka at her core is not who everybody thinks and observes that she is. That even though she has such a terrible reputation and such wicked desires in her soul, he sees even deeper who she truly is at her core. And it's this beautiful scene in the book where all of a sudden Grushenka, she completely changes. And she experiences a profound conversion just because this man saw her for who she truly was. And not as an object, or not as the wicked sinner that everybody else sees. Now, I bring up this passage not only because I love the story, and anytime I can bring it up in church, it's a beautiful thing to bring up. I bring it up because of the gospel passage that we heard from today. One of the interesting things about the Gospel of Mark is the theme of evil as well, just like the stories from Dostoevsky. In the Gospel of Mark, the very first public act that Jesus performed in his ministry was an exorcism. We're going to be hearing from the Gospel of Mark all through this year in our lectionary. And we're going to hear about all these different stories about unclean spirits and demons. Christ came to our earth to cast out the evil, to cast out the darkness, to cast out demons. And it's important for all of us to recognize that evil really does exist. There really are demons in our world, even in the church. It's striking that in the Gospel of Mark, right, where does this man with an unclean spirit appear? In the synagogue, in the church. All of us, whether we like to admit it or not, all of us recognize that even in the church, there can be demons. Even in ourselves, we can have demons. Not in a literal way like being possessed or something like that, but literally sometimes the sins that we take on throughout our life, or the suffering that happens to us, oftentimes it becomes like a little demon that sticks with us and causes us to even more sinfulness, or worse, to despair. And I think it's interesting when you read through the Gospel of Mark and all the other Gospels, that when Jesus comes to cast out evil, he doesn't so much do it by, speaking judgment upon the person who has an unclean spirit, or the person who is a terrible sinner. Instead, he sees the person for who they are. And that's what brings about such a profound change. Think about the story of Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, who had been a prostitute with 7 demons that Jesus cast out of her. Christ saw who she was at her core, and that changed everything for her. Think about the story of Zacchaeus, right? The tax collector who everyone hated because he took advantage of everyone. When Jesus met Zacchaeus on the road, he did not bring up his sins. He did not tell him he needed to change. He simply called Zacchaeus by name. He saw him. And in response, Zacchaeus, without even being provoked, told Christ that he was going to give all of his earnings to the poor. and to give back what he had taken advantage of, just by Christ seeing him for who he truly was. What I'm trying to say is that all of us, we experience many different demons as we go through this life, either in ourselves or in others. And oftentimes it's tempting for us to just become angry and frustrated, to judge that person or to call them out. But sometimes the most powerful thing that we can possibly do is simply to see the best in someone. Just by somebody being seen for who they really are, and not for their failures, not for their sins, it can bring about an immense change. There's many examples I can think about in my own life, right, where I have experienced this, right, as a recipient, right, as giving it to someone else. Right? And I remember a few years back, I was in a parish, and one of the staff members, she could be kind of rough with people. She had a habit of snapping at people for different things. And when I got to the parish, it didn't take very long for that to start happening with me. And I kind of would snap back. So it was frustrating. And after a couple of months of being there, I realized that if I was going to make the relationship any better, I had to try to see the best in her. And so I actually spent time praying about this person and thinking about what are the ways that God sees this person. And I began to see the good. I began to understand why she was so protective or confrontational about certain things. And I never actually told her I did this, but naturally our relationship got better and better. She could literally feel a difference in how I saw her. I think about an old friend who I was able to meet up and get lunch with recently, and she was telling me about how she's been coaching cross country at her local Catholic school. And she was telling me about how the team performed. They ended up winning the county sectionals or whatever it is, the city tournament, whatever it is. And she was explaining to me how she did it. And she was telling me about all the different runners on the cross-country team, and I could see and I could feel coming from her. Whether she was talking about the most gifted athlete or the one who was just trying the hardest. She had so much love in her voice as she talked about every single student on the cross-country team. And now they have this ironic situation at the Catholic school where all the football players are actually quitting football to join the cross-country team. And the coaches are upset about it. But it's such a beautiful example. What is she doing for all of those students? She's seeing the very best in them. She's seeing who they really are. She's seeing them in a different way than their peers, most of their teachers, their coaches see them. The power of seeing the best in someone has an unbelievable ability to completely change that person and to begin to slowly scare those demons away that those people carry with them. I think back to when I was in high school, and perhaps the person in my life who changed the trajectory of my life more than anybody else was the priest who came to my church. And the way that he talked about my ability to lead, or the way that he talked to me about the seminary, the priesthood, he just had this way of speaking to me in such a way where it was like I could tell that he always saw more in me. And he made me think that I was capable of doing something like the priesthood. Psychologists, they call this many different terms. They call it validation or they call it affirmation. But it doesn't originate in psychology. It originates in the gospel itself. Christ had an ability to see the very best in people. And that's what changed them. They leave behind their occupations. They leave behind their old habits of sinfulness. They'd even go across the world because of the way that he saw them. They would do anything. Are we people who see the best in others? How do we react when people's sins and demons, right, inflict themselves upon us? Do we still see the best in those people? If Christ came to this earth to cast out the darkness and to cast out the evil, and he did it precisely by affirmation, then we have to do the same. Are you the kind of person who sees the very best in your spouse, even though you know all about their failures? Are you the kind of person who sees the best in your children, even when they do things that annoy you, or they make decisions completely contrary to what you want for them? Are you the kind of person who sees your boss for the best that is in that person, and not just focusing on all the ways that that person has treated you unjustly or unfairly, or has played favorites with other people? How do you look at people? How do you see them? How do you interact with them? People can literally feel from us how we do them, as showed with that staff member we interacted with. The beautiful thing about affirmation and about casting out the darkness, so say certain psychologists, is that when you affirm somebody, when you see the very best in them, it's like you literally give birth to them as a new person. That so much of how we see ourselves and so many insecurities that people carry with them, the best way to cure it is by somebody seeing the best in them. It gives them ability to have assurance and confidence in who they are and what they're capable of. I think it would be good for all of us to reflect on this weekend. How are we affirming and seeing the best in the people around us, and thereby casting out the demons who are always lurking?